Years ago, I became very close with a manager of mine and we hung out after work pretty often. He seemed like a genuinely great guy. He moved back to his hometown years later and we kept in touch on Facebook until he just stopped responding. Then I went to try to message him again and his profile was gone. I decided to Google him, half expecting to find an obituary or something, but instead I found out he was charged with some pedo stuff and in jail. I never got any kind of weird vibes from him and I'm still shocked. When I was about 12, my family found out that my dad cheated on my mom, as well as every other ex-wife he had before her. Now, years later, women still recognize my mom as the one who was married to that one awful guy. One woman met her in a bar and ended up telling her stories about how my dad would stalk her again and again. Once she even had to call her own dad to escort him off their property with a gun because he wouldn't leave. All of this happened while he was married to my mom. I knew this guy from childhood, his family lived around the block, I worked with him in a corner shop as a teenager, went to the same school and then ended up at the same university. He became a doctor. I studied on a totally different part of campus but would still bump into him occasionally. Anyways, he was odd. Most of our mutual friends thought he was strange. I'd moved to another country for post-grad/work. Hadn't chatted to him in a few years, although I had him on Facebook, saw that he'd finally came out as gay, everybody assumed, thought he'd qualified as a doctor. Didn't really give any thought to the guy. One morning I am woken by constant pings from Facebook Messenger. I have 20 plus messages from friends who used to also work at the corner shop. They hired a lot of students. I scroll to the top and open a message from a childhood friend to the link to a news article. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This guy had driven over to his family home at night and beaten his, partially disabled, mother to death with a chisel while wearing a Halloween mask. She nearly escaped and made it to the grandparents' home, but he caught her and killed her. The community was rattled. It was a headline story back home. Really felt so sorry for his family at the time. He's in prison, rightfully. Being that close to someone capable of that still gives me the shivers, honestly. A really great guy I dated for a bit just seemed a little distant when we saw each other. He was very aware and sensitive to things people did and said, and while he knew that and covered it up, I could sense it was still there. He was so kind, gentle, and genuine. A couple years after, we reconnected just as friends and he let me know he had been severely abused by his parents, and then by his foster parents, and also had highly abusive romantic relationships in the past. It made me so sad, and disturbed me so much, that this really kind soul had been through so much that he couldn't trust or get close to anyone in life. He deserves the world and instead he's alone, completely alone, and can't figure out how to get out of that. And there was nothing I could do or say to help. I still think about him a lot. It's really upsetting to see someone drown, and they know they're drowning. He's been in therapy for a while but is still really struggling. I hope he'll figure it out someday. When I was 12 years old, I had a neighbor, and I would occasionally babysit for his kids. He only had one rule, which was don't go on his computer. Normal enough, right? Wouldn't want someone going through my things. Only, one of his daughter went on it and I saw weird pictures of girls. He swiftly moved away not even a month later. Turns out he had photos of children hidden under his floorboards, only these were children that had gone missing. The guy that moved into his house told my parents the photos were very concerning. We never found out if he was found and charged or not. I hope his children are okay. My friend lived next door to a few young women who were in an assisted living space as they were mentally disabled. I was drinking at his house with one of his other mates one night, and woke up the next morning to find out that one of the girls at the house next door had been raped. It was pretty scary, and we all got questioned the next day about anything we had seen. A few weeks later, I saw in the newspaper that it was my friend's mate who was over. He snuck out in the middle of the night to do it, then came back into the house and went to bed like nothing happened. Really shook me, 'cause I thought he seemed really cool. Makes it hard to trust anyone. Annoying guy in my town came to local pub gigs all the time and wants to sit in and does the same two songs. Claimed to be a boat captain, often had something, usually music gear, to sell. Had a very young quiet female housemate who didn't speak English very well. One guy in my band could tolerate him better than the rest of us and would have him back to his flat after hours for more drinks, etc. Trusting bandmate winds up loaning him money and it takes forever to get paid back. Eventually someone Googles him and it turns out he's a total professional con man with a trail of angry people in his past all over the world. Had a scam where he would go to a country club acting like a big shot with a boat and suddenly discover he'd been robbed and needed temporary lodging, money, etc. There's an old Yahoo group devoted to tracking him down and warning people from the early 2000s. Evidently he did some time for his crimes and now was released. Eventually got barred from most pubs we played it over, trying to scam free drinks, running a tab, etc. Still see him around occasionally. I grew up being babysat by a woman who was married to a fella named John. He was Air Force, security forces. I really looked up to him. Even when I grew up and became an adult, John was like someone I really admired as a role model. Well, I found out in my early 20s that he had divorced the woman he was married to when I was a kid. He and his new wife fought a lot, and one day, I guess they just got into an especially bad one. He leaves the house, gets shit-faced, comes home and starts to literally physically fight his wife. She calls the cops, and when they get there, he pulls his service weapon out and shoots her. Cops shot and killed him. We think it was his plan to commit suicide by cop, but you never know. It's absolutely wild to think that someone who I remember as being the absolute coolest would shoot his own wife. My literal best friend from high school suddenly dropped off the planet, deleting their Facebook and all other social media accounts. We'd usually have a beer at the pub at least a couple of times a week, then nothing. About a month later, they randomly create another account and start chatting to me on Facebook. But something was off. Wasn't my best friend at all. I literally asked questions only he would know and he would suddenly have to go, but answer about a day or two later and start off like nothing happened. Not long after that, they drop off the planet again. A couple of months pass and the truth finally comes out when our other best friend gave me a call. The dumb SOB was caught sending nudes to underage schoolgirls and attempting to entice them to sleep with him. The cops had used his account to try and potentially trap other pedophiles, and because I had a computer shop at the time, they were almost set on the fact that I had to be somehow involved. I literally vomited. I myself had kids, and a young girl by that stage. There were no obvious signs at all that my best friend was actually a rock spider. Back in college, I was decently good friends with this lovely couple. The girl was in my year, the guy was a year older. The guy graduates and moves far away, they end up breaking up. A few months later, she wakes up in the middle of the night to a strange noise from her living room. When she sees what's going on, she finds her ex, who she thinks is thousands of miles away, sitting in her living room with her phone, computer, and other electronics, and he's installing bugs and listening devices on all of them. Turns out he really didn't take the breakup well, became obsessed with her, and flew all the way here to break into her apartment and bug her stuff in the night. He ended up getting arrested and deported from the United States. A deacon at the church I went to as a kid molested children. This one is probably pretty common, but I grew up in a town small enough that it's not even a map dot. It was pretty devastating for the community, and I was still a kid when it was discovered. After he got out of prison, I also learned what hypocrites most of the people at church were. A big chunk of the congregation wanted to act like absolutely nothing happened. They actively pushed the parents of the victims to forgive the guy like good Christians and allow him to rejoin the church. I was a teenager who was already pretty ready to be done with religion. That whole event probably killed whatever faith I had. My uncle wasn't super present when I was growing up because he was military and was deployed for most of my life before honorably discharging, so I didn't know much about him, just that we had differing political views and that he had severe PTSD. For his son's wedding, my mom rented an Airbnb with my grandparents and my aunt/uncle so we could stay in the area for the week, and of course that led to us having deeper conversations. One night, he was explaining to me how his PTSD manifests, and went into detail as to why, and it wasn't from his time in the military. Apparently when he was super young, toddler age, he ingested 13 hits of LSD while under the care of negligent babysitters, who in their panic, called his mom and explained the situation. His mom told them to just let him write it out. He also went into detail about an abusive ex-boyfriend his mom saw for a time that tried to murder him. I instantly felt a greater sense of empathy towards him, because as he described the symptoms of PTSD, I realized I, too, had PTSD, but from different experiences. Now I have a great deal of respect for him and how strong he is to have survived that ordeal. However, it is super disturbing to know he had to deal with it. A guy in the 2000s catfished me. I took 3 trains to meet him because I was a stupid teenager. I arrived at the tiny town hours later looking for this 5'11", brown-haired 19 years old only to see a 5'4" bald, Danny DeVito twin barreling at me. I was mortified. I decided to go ahead and just be kind. Never let him touch me. Turned out he was 28. I strongly believe special needs. Though he could drive, his parents controlled his finances and out of his paycheck, they gave him an allowance. He wasn't allowed to drive his car where his dad hadn't approved. It was bonkers. I left, blocked him. Randomly thought of him last year and searched his name. He was in the courts for trying to lure a 13-year-old by sending her nudes and perverted chats. Only case proven is she kept the texts and showed her dad, who was his friend, flushed-faced. They don't know if there are others, but the judge agreed he is definitely on some spectrum and he will have to register for life. I still get the icky thinking back to my stupid meetup. I lived next door to a guy who tried to have his family killed while on vacation. Eventually, he ended up beating his son to death and his wife most of the way there. His daughter had managed to escape and call for help. He then rode his motorcycle into oncoming traffic rather than be caught because he didn't want to deal with a court-martial. NCIS found his son in black garbage bags, stuffed in the master bedroom closet. The kid was in pieces. His wife's skull was exposed, and she'll need a helmet for the rest of her life. The daughter got out with just stitches and a broken arm, if I remember correctly. It was so disturbing because the son was my little brother's best friend. We tried to keep details from him because it would have really messed him up, but small Navy bases talk and he found out eventually what happened to his friend. The daughter was in my mother's culinary class and the whole community was just fucking devastated. The Navy did the family a solid and ruled his death an accident so the wife wouldn't be screwed out of benefits and her daughter could finish high school. The military does a lot of bad shit, but everybody closed ranks to protect this mother and daughter. It was so fucking awful. They were in the apartment next to us and we never heard a thing. Then they moved on base and damn near the next day, all this awful shit happened. The dude traumatized a whole bus of Japanese tourists because he was a nasty piece of work. His whole motivation was apparently he had a secret family, so instead of, getting a fucking divorce, he did shit like have his family brutally attacked and kidnapped over vacation. I'm so glad that dude is dead. I just wish none of that shit had happened to his family. They were genuinely sweet and the whole thing could not have happened to a nicer family. I still think about it and it's been something like 15 years since that happened.
Thanks for watching. Keep enjoying our videos. Like and subscribe.